Hey, we are in Nehemiah. We're going to finish it up. Chapters 11, 12, and 13 might be a little bit longer, but let's go ahead and wrap up the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah has finished the city, the walls. They're able to worship. Now it's time to populate. It's time to get people in there, give them responsibilities, get going. We're also going to see a time where Nehemiah goes back to the king of Babylon. He's gone for about a decade, a little bit more than that, 10 to 12 years. And then we'll see what happens when he returns and if the people and their commitment has really been strong. So let's get into Nehemiah chapter 11. A lot of names that I'm going to mess up. So here we go. The nation's leaders and their families settled in Jerusalem, but there was room for only one out of every 10 of the remaining families. So they asked God to show them who would live there. Then everyone else asked God to bless those who were willing to live in Jerusalem. Some of the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the temple workers, and the descendants of Solomon's servants lived on their own property in the towns of Judah. But the leaders of the province lived in Jerusalem with their families. From the Judah tribe, 2 leaders settled in Jerusalem with their relatives. One of them was Aphiah, son of Uzziah. His ancestors were Zechariah, Amariah, Shephatiah, Mahalalel, and Perez, the son of Judah. From the descendants of Perez, 468 of the best men lived in Jerusalem. The other leader from Judah was Messiah, the son of Baruch. His ancestors were Kolhizah, Heziah, Adiah, Jorab, Zechariah, and Shelah, the son of Judah. From the Benjamin tribe, 3 leaders settled in Jerusalem. The first was Salu, son of Meshullam, and the others were Gabai and Salai. Salu's ancestors were Joed, Pedaiah, Koliah, Maaseiah, Ithiel, and Jeshai. Altogether, there were 928 men of Benjamin tribe living in Jerusalem. Joel, son of Zichri, was their leader. The Judah, son of Hassenuah, was second in command. 4 priests settled in Jerusalem. The first was Jediah. He was the son of Jorab, the uncle of Jachin. The second priest to settle there was Sahara, son of Hilkiah. His ancestors were Meshullam, Zadok, Mirioth, and Ahitub, who had been a high priest. Altogether, there were 822 from his clan who served in the temple. The third priest to settle there was Adai, son of Joram. His ancestors were Palali, Amzi, Zechariah, Pashur, and Milkijah. Altogether, there were 242 clan leaders among his relatives. The fourth priest to settle there was Amashai, son of Azarel. His ancestors were Ahizai, Meshalumoth, and Immer. Altogether, there were 128 brave warriors from their clans, and their leader was Zabdiel, son of Haggedolim. Several Levites settled in Jerusalem. First, there was Shimei, son of Hashub. His ancestors were Azrikam, Hashabiah, and Buni. Next, there was Shephathai and Jozabad, who were in charge of the work outside the temple. Then there was Mattaniah, son of Micah. His ancestors was Zabdi and Asaph. Mattaniah led the temple choir in the prayer of praise. Bakbukiah, who also settled in Jerusalem, was his assistant. Finally, there was Abda, son of Shemua. His grandfather was Galel, and his great-grandfather was Jeduthun. Altogether, 284 Levites settled in the holy city. 172 temple guards settled in Jerusalem, and their leaders were Akub and Talmon. The rest of the Israelites, including priests and Levites, lived on their own property in other towns of Judah. But the temple workers lived in the section of Jerusalem known as Ophel, and the 2 men in charge of them were Ziha and Gishpa. Uzi, son of Bani, was the leader of the Levites in Jerusalem, and his grandfather was Hashabiah, his great-grandfather was Mattaniah, and his great-great-grandfather was Micah. He belonged to the Asaph clan that was in charge of the music for the temple services. Though the daily choice of music and musicians was decided by royal decree, of the Persian king. The people of Israel were represented at the Persian court by Pethahiah, son of Meshezabel, from the Zerah clan of the Judah tribe. Some of the people of Judah lived in the following towns near their farms: Kiriath Arba, Dibon, Jekabzeel, Jeshua, Moladah, Beth Pelet, Hazar Shuel, Beersheba, Ziklag, Mechanah, and Rimmon, Zorah, Jarmuth, Zanoah, Adullam, Lachish, and Azekah. In fact, they settled the towns from Beersheba in the south to Hinnon Valley in the north. The people of Benjamin lived in the towns of Geba, Michmash, Ahijah, Bethel, with its nearby villages, Anathoth, Nob, Ananiah, Hazor, Ramah, Gitam, Hadid, Zeboam, Nebalat, Lod, and Ono, as well as in Craft Valley. Several groups of Levites from the territory of Judah were sent to live among the people of Benjamin. Many priests and Levites had returned from Babylonia with Zerubbabel and Joshua as their leaders. Those priests were Sariah, Jeremiah, Ezra, Amariah, Maluk, Hattush, Zechariah, Rehum, Meremoth, Iddo, Ginnathoi, Abijah, Mijamin, Madiah, Bilgah, Shemaiah, Jorab, Jediah, Salu, Amok, Hilkiah, and another Jediah. These were the leading priests and their assistants during the time of Joshua. The Levites who returned from Jeshua, Benui, Kadmiel, Sherebiah, Judah, and Mattaniah. They and their assistants were responsible for the songs of praise with Bakbukiah and Uno. Together with their assistants were responsible for the choral responses. Joshua was the father of Joachim, the grandfather of Eliashib, and the great-grandfather of Joiada. Joiada was the father of Jonathan, and the great-grandfather and the grandfather of Jeduah. When Jehoiakim was high priest, the following priests were leaders of their clans: Moriah of the Sarai clan, Hananiah of Jeremiah, Meshullam of Ezra, Jehoinan of Amariah, Jonathan of Maluki, Joseph of Shebaniah, Adnah of Haram, Hilkiah of Marioth, Zechariah of Iddo, Meshullam of Ginnathon, Zikri of Abijah, Piltai of Modiah, Shemua of Bilgah, Johonathan of Shemai, Mattanai of Jorab, Uzi of Jedai, Kalai of Salai, Eber of Amok, Hashabiah of Hilkiah, and Nathanael of Jediah. During the time of the high priests, Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jeduah, and including the time that Darius was king of Persia, a record was kept of the heads of the Levite and priestly families. However, no official record was kept of the heads of the Levite clans after the death of Johanan, the grandson of Eliashib. Hashabiah, Sherebiah, Jeshua, son of Kadmiel, and their assistants organized two choirs of Levites to offer praises to God, just as King David, the man of God, had commanded. Mattaniah, Bakbukiah, Obadiah, Meshullam, Talmon, and Akub were responsible for guarding the storerooms near the temple gates. All of these men lived during the time of Joachim and during the time that I was governor, and Ezra, a teacher of the law of Moses, was priest. When the city wall was dedicated, Levites from everywhere in Judah were invited to join in the celebration with songs of praise, with the music of cymbals, small harps, and other stringed instruments. The Levite singers lived in the villages around Jerusalem, and so they came from there, as well as from the villages around Netopha, Beth Gilgal, Geba, and Azmaveth. The priests and the Levites held special ceremonies to make themselves holy, and then they did the same for the rest of the people and for the gates and walls of the city. I brought the leaders of Judah to the top of the city wall and put them in charge of the two groups that were to march around the top of the wall singing praises to God. One group marched to the right in the direction of the garbage gate. Hoshea and half of the leaders followed them. And then came the priests, Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah, all of them blowing trumpets. Next, there was Zechariah of the Asaph clan and his relatives, Shemaiah, Azarel, Melalel, Gilalai, Mai, Nathanael, Judah, and Hanani. They played musical instruments like those that had been played by David, this man of God, and they marched behind Ezra, the teacher of the law. When they reached the fountain gate, they climbed the steps of David's city and went past his palace before stopping at the water gate near the eastern wall of the city. The second group of singers marched along the wall in the opposite direction, and I followed them. Together with the other half of the leaders of Judah, we went past Oven Tower, Broad Wall, Ephraim Gate, Old Gate, Fish Gate, Hananel Tower, Hundred Tower, and on to Sheep Gate. Finally, we stopped at Gate of the Guard, where we stood in front of the temple with the other group praising God. In the group with me were half of the leaders, as well as the priest Eliakim, Maaseiah, Minamim, Micaiah, Elionai, Zechariah, and Hananiah, who were blowing trumpets. Maaseiah, Shemai, Eleazar, Uzi, Johanan, Melchijah, Elam, and Ezer also stood there, as Jezreiah led the singers. God had made the people very happy, and so on that day they celebrated and offered many sacrifices. The women and children joined in the festivities, and joyful shouts could be heard far from the city of Jerusalem. On that same day, some leaders were appointed to be responsible for the safekeeping of gifts for the temple and to be in charge of receiving the first part of the harvest and the 10% of the crops and livestock that was offered to God. These same leaders also collected the part of crops that the law of Moses taught was to be given to the Levites. Everyone was pleased with the work of the priests and Levites when they performed the ceremonies to make people acceptable to worship God. And the singers and the temple guards did their jobs according to the instructions given by David and his son Solomon. In fact, ever since the days of David and Asaph, there had been song leaders and songs of praise and worship. During the time of that Zerubbabel and I were in charge, everyone in Israel gave what they were supposed to give for the daily needs of the singers and temple guards from the Levite tribe. Then the Levites would give the priests their share from what they had received. On that day, when the law of Moses was read aloud to everyone, it was discovered that Ammonites and Moabites were forbidden to belong to the people of God. This was because they had refused to give food and water to Israel and had hired Balaam to call down a curse on them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. Following their reading of the law of Moses, the people of Israel started sending away anyone who had any foreign ancestors. The priest Eliashib was a relative of Tobiah and had earlier been put in charge of the temple storerooms. So he let Tobiah live in one of these storerooms where all the other kinds of things had been stored, the grain offerings, incense, utensils for the temple, as well as the tenth of the grain, wine, and olive oil that had been given for the use of the Levites, singers, temple guards, and the gifts for the priests. This happened in the 32nd year that Artaxerxes ruled Babylonia. I was away from Jerusalem at that time because I was visiting him, and later I received permission from the king to return to Jerusalem. Only then did I find out that Eliashib had done this terrible thing of letting Tobiah have a room in the temple. It upset me so much that I threw out every bit of Tobiah's furniture. Then I ordered the room to be cleaned and the temple utensils and grain offerings and the incense to be brought back into the room. I also found out that the temple singers and several other Levites had returned to work on their farms because they had not been given their share of the harvest. I called the leaders together and angrily asked them, "Why is the temple neglected?" Then I told them to start doing their jobs. After this, everyone in Judah brought a tenth of their grain, wine, and olive oil to the temple storeroom. Finally, I appointed 3 men with good reputations to be in charge of what was brought there and to distribute it to the others. They were Shelemiah, the priest, Zadok, the teacher of the law, and Pedaiah, the Levite. Their assistant was Hanan, the son of Zakur, and the grandson of Mattaniah. I pray that my God will remember these good things that I have done for his temple and for those who worship there. I also noticed that the people of Judah were what the people of Judah were doing on the Sabbath. Not only were they trampling grapes to make wine, but they were harvesting their grain, grapes, figs, and other crops, then loading these on donkeys to sell in Jerusalem. So I warned them not to sell food on the Sabbath. People who had moved to Jerusalem from the city of Tyre were bringing in fish and other things to sell there on the Sabbath. I got angry and said to the leaders of Judah, "This evil you are doing is an insult to the Sabbath. Didn't God punish us and this city because our ancestors did this very same things? And here you are, about to make God furious again by disgracing the Sabbath." I ordered the gates of Jerusalem to be closed on the eve of the Sabbath and not to be opened until after the Sabbath had ended. Then I put some of my own men in charge of the gates to make certain that nothing was brought in on the Sabbath. Once or twice, some merchants spent the night outside Jerusalem with their goods, but I warned them, if you do this again, I'll have you arrested. From then on, they did not come on the Sabbath. I ordered the Levites to make themselves holy and to guard the gates of the Sabbath so that it would be kept holy. God is truly merciful, and I pray that he will treat me with kindness and bless me for doing this. I discovered that some Jewish men had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. About half of their children could not speak Hebrew. They spoke only the language of Ashdod or some other foreign language. So in my anger, I called down curses on these men. I had them beaten and even pulled out the hair of some of them. And then I made them promise in the name of God. We solemnly promised not to let our sons and daughters marry foreigners. God dearly loved King Solomon of Israel and made him the greatest king on earth, but Solomon's foreign wives led him into sin. So we will obey you and not rebel against our God by marrying foreign women. Jehoiada, the son of the high priest Eliashib, had a son who had married a daughter of Sanballat from Horon, and I forced his son to leave. I pray that God will punish them for breaking their priestly vows and disgracing the Levi tribe. Then I made sure that the people were free from every foreign influence, and I assigned duties for the priests and Levites. I also arranged for the people to bring firewood to the altar each day and for them to bring the first part of the harvest to the temple. I pray that God will bless me for the good I have done. So we see several things happening as we wrap up the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Uh, um, Nehemiah had gone back to the king for a while, probably a decade or so. He comes back, and the priest is a relative of Tobiah. Tobiah was trying to ruin everything that Nehemiah had done. It's no wonder that Nehemiah was furious with what taken place. And then we know that at the end of chapter, I believe it was 11 or 12, the people signed a covenant. They said, "We will not intermarry. We will keep the Sabbath, and we will not work on the Sabbath, and we will tithe, and we will give." And so Nehemiah comes back, and none of that has happened. None of it. They've intermarried. They've had kids. They don't speak the language anymore. They've not given to the temple, and so the priests have had to go out and get jobs because they can't be supported. They're working on the Sabbath. It's just Nehemiah is just so frustrated, and he just hopes. His prayer is that he has done enough, that he has done his best, and he's given it to God. And really, that's what is expected of us. We're not going to be perfect. God just wants us to give our best. And here's what we notice about the people, and here's what we notice about us sometimes. The people knew the law. They knew what they were supposed to do. They were for it. They agreed with it. They just didn't practice it. It didn't sink into their heart. We know God's word, and we know what's right, and we know what's wrong. We become the best that God can use when that is sealed in our heart, and we don't go left or right of that when we are faithful. So that's the challenge. Be faithful. Follow God. Have a great day.